Okay, the peace conference in France. On December 4th, 1918, President Wilson left for France. On December 4th of 1918, President Wilson left for France. How did he get there, Charles? How did he get there? Yeah, he sailed. We always kind of think he just got an airplane and went. That wasn't true. He set sail for France. And so he's not going to get there like the same day, right? Well, it was the first time in American history, if you can believe this, this is the first time in American history that an American president traveled to Europe. This is 1918. And it's the first time in American history that a United States president traveled to Europe. That's something when you think about how much they move around today. So, on December 4th, 1918, President Wilson set sail for France, and for the first time in United States history, an American president would be traveling to Europe. When he got to France, was he well received or not? Very well received. Why would he be? Because the Americans won the war for him. He was known in France as, quote, the great peacemaker from America. So he arrived to a huge ovation of cheering French, very appreciative of what he had done to save their bacon, and they referred to President Wilson as the great peacemaker from America. Now this peace conference was scheduled for January 18th, 1919. So you can see it takes a little while to get to Europe on the boat, right? So the peace conference was scheduled for January 18th, 1919 at the Palace of Versailles. The Palace of Versailles. So this peace conference in France after World War I was scheduled in France on January 18th, 1919 at the Palace of Versailles. Now, when we talked about Andrew Jackson, he coined a special phrase. What was it? Remember? Hear it sometimes at the end of the Super Bowl or when they present the trophy. To the victor belong the spoils. So the people that are going to be at this peace conference are going to be people from what nations? Not specific nations, but overall. The Central Powers or the Allies? Allies, because to the victor belong the spoils. So the losing team isn't going to be represented in this one. They're going to tell the losers what's going to happen to them. Okay? So, decisions are going to be made at the peace conference are going to be made by leaders of the allied nations. And there'll be 4 that will be there. 4. Who was the first one? Obviously. President Wilson of the United States. Very good. What other country do you think would be represented there? What's that? Yeah, Great Britain. And the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time was David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George. So Great Britain will be represented by David Lloyd George. What other country is going to be there, Andrew? France. Georges Clemenceau of France. Georges Clemenceau of France will be there as well. Georges Clemenceau of France. So you got President Wilson of the United States, Georges Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Great Britain.
What was the French guy? What was he?
Prime Minister of France. Yeah, leader of France.
Wait,
Now
so,
what?
I'm confused. So David Lloyd George was representing who?
Well, what kind of a name does he have?
Great Britain.
Great Britain.
Great Britain.
Yeah.
Okay.
Clemenceau would be what? French. Georges
Okay.
Clemenceau. Yeah. Now, what's the only other country missing? Russia, but they don't show up. You know who shows up? The leader of Italy. Because Italy kind of one of those countries that jumped in at the end on the side of the Allies. Vittorio Orlando of Italy is among the negotiators. And Italy has a pretty good relationship with Russia. You'll find out when we get into World War II, right? Only they're on the wrong side of things there. Okay, so Vittorio Orlando of Italy will be the other leader of the Allied nation that shows up at the peace conference. What are these, Mackenzie, what are these 4-minute history known as? The Big Four. They're known as the Big Four. And what do they talk about? As far as Wilson's 14 points, which points are they talking about? Well, kind of all, but no, what's the most important ones they're talking about? 6 through 13, the what? Reconstruction of Europe. What does Wilson want them to talk about? Point 14, okay? The first two, you know, the alliances and freedoms of the seas, is that something you really negotiate at a throw? No, I mean, that's something that people have to figure out on their own, right? But they did talk points 6 through 13, and they did reconstruct Europe. But what happens when you do that? Let me see if I can make a good example here. I'm the teacher here, and I'm representing the country of AP US History 1, and I'm going to meet with Mr. McGee, and he's going to have junior English, and then another leader is going to be, I don't know who teaches, but I'm just going to say Mrs. Wiley, and she's representing junior math, and then Mr. Barris is representing junior science. And we're all getting together to decide what we're going to do with Warland High School, because this is Europe, okay? And we are the winners, us four. There's 4 corps of the winners. So what can happen when we get together and try to redesign Warland High School? Well, maybe, possibly, over what? Pretty close. What? Well, what?
How do you decide what you're going to do for other countries that you're talking about, like Belgium, and they're not being represented there?
Well, not so much. I'm talking about Barris, Wiley, McGee, and Durr. We all have different subjects, right? We're all different countries, and we, the 4 of us, are going to talk points 6 through 13 to restructure Warland High School. What am I going to do?
You're going to want more of history.
Damn right I am. I'm going to be wanting what's in the best interest of me. Well, we need to add more history to this school. Well, we need to add more English. Well, the math department needs new textbooks, and you guys don't ever use your textbooks, so you don't need any. So what happened is these other 3 leaders were more interested in pursuing their own interests for their own nations than they were really dealing with the restructuring of Europe equally. Does that make sense? By God, I want my cut. And what are they totally ignoring? Because they don't care about it because they're interested in their own interests. Number 14. So the point is during this peace conference, Wilson soon realizes he's kind of on an island of his own. The other 3 leaders, Clement Show, George, and Orlando, are much more interested in pursuing national interests for their own countries than they are forming any kind of a League of Nations. Okay? It'd be like, and I'm just using this example, so don't take this and run with it. It'd be like all the sports teams here. Bring it in and say, we're going to have all the same rules for everybody. Not going to work? Not really, because the boys basketball coach might have a different philosophy and you come into practice than the girls soccer coach, or the girls volleyball coach might be more lenient than boys track. You see what I'm saying? And so everybody likes to have their own league. They don't want to get together in a League of Nations. These coaches don't want to get together and have all the same rules. But it does make sense that we get all of our coaches together. For example, to talk about coaches meetings. What are we doing here? What are we doing? Are we being consistent in training rules? So that's probably a good thing there. But these guys weren't interested in that. So when the peace conference ended, Wilson returned to the United States without approval worldwide of the League of Nations, right? Now, this is kind of a difficult question, but you might be able to get it. So, who does he want to help him talk these other nations into having a League of Nations? Who would you go to now? Who would you, he couldn't get it done by himself, right? So who might he go to in America to help him do that? Who might he go to? What? Before that, you're getting close. Who would he might go to try to get these people to use their influence in Europe to help him out with this League of Nations? Congress, especially the Senate. Okay, so at home the president decided he would go to the Senate to try to get some help from them to establish a League of Nations with European countries. Now, these senators go to their constituents, which are, as Brian said earlier, what? People, the public. Now, let's think about this a little bit. Right after a war in which 15 million people were killed, and especially lost the lives of about 116,000 Americans and 200,000 were wounded, what do you think about the last thing the American people want to be involved in? Europe, more of Europe. Very good, my dear. And what happened is the president was opposed by many people in the United States who didn't want to see us get mixed up in European affairs. My God, we just fought a war. The heck with those Europeans. They can figure it out on their own. We bailed them out. Lost over 116,000 American GIs in the process and 200,000 more wounded. So he doesn't get the support from the people, who then, it results in him not getting the support from the Senate. Now, when he didn't get support from the people who told their senators, what was the next thing he did to try to drum up public support? What would you do? Okay, you go to the Senate, they poll their constituents. The constituents are telling the Senate, we're tired of European affairs. What would be your last step to try to talk people into this? What?
Go to the house.
Go to maybe their houses. No, close. What he did is he decided to take his case for a League of Nations straight to the people. So he began a long series of grueling speaking tours. And he went all across the country to speak to people about how important this League of Nations would be. How did he travel there? How did he go from town to town? Lincoln did it when he was running for president, and after he was president, he was on the back of a train. He said, I'm here to see and be seen. So they went by train. So Wilson had this special presidential train that he would travel from place to place to place. The train would stop. He would speak out the back end of the train, so to speak, and talk to these people about the great things concerning a League of Nations. And he started that speaking tour in early September of 1919. Early September of 1919. And he's going to, kind of like Sully said, go door to door, go to their houses, in a way. He's going to, if the President of the United States took a train through Warland and gave a speech, the whole town would be there. Whether you liked him or not, they was to see the President. And that was his idea. And he knew he'd get people there to listen, and so early in September 1919, President Wilson began a grueling speaking tour on a special train that carried him across the nation. He traveled over 100,000 miles and gave over 40 speeches concerning support for the United Nations. Traveled over 100,000 miles and gave 40 speeches. What would that do to you? You bet it did. It really made him frail and weak. Really made him frail and weak. It was a grueling speaking tour. I'll tell you, give an example. On September 25th of 1919, which was his last speech of 40, on September 25th of 1919, his last speech of 40, what's that? He did it. Yeah, yeah, boom, 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 yeah. Well, after a speech on September 25th of 1919, he collapsed in Colorado. He was given a speech in Colorado and he collapsed. And what did they do with him? Where'd they take him, at least, when he collapsed? Not immediately, but eventually, you know, got him back home, so to speak. Where'd they take him? Where does he live? Yeah, take him back to Washington, D.C. So he collapses in Colorado on September 25th, 1919, after a speech there, his last one, and they take him back to D.C. And he needs some rest bad. Really needs some rest. About a week later, on October 2nd, Mrs. Wilson is looking for her husband, and she finds him on the bathroom floor of the White House, paralyzed by a stroke. So about a week later, after he collapsed in Colorado, and they brought him back to D.C., about a week later, on October 2nd, 1919, Mrs. Wilson finds the president on the bathroom floor of the White House, paralyzed by a stroke. Now, who took over running the country the rest of Wilson's term? Who ran the country after Wilson's stroke? You don't know? What? What? What did you say? Say it. You might be right. His wife is correct. Yes, very good, Ryland. His wife made the major decisions in the White House after that. Who would that irritate badly?
The vice president.
Well, probably. But who in general would be upset about that? Well, maybe men would be upset, but what particular group? Let's even get wider than that. Well, you're up.
America.
All right, all of a sudden, let me see if I can think this over, because I got to do this right. Let's say that Barack Obama has a stroke, and his wife Michelle starts to run the country. Who's going to be upset in Wyoming? Everybody, because what kind of state are we? What political party does Obama belong to? So what are we? So who's going to be upset about her aggressiveness in making all these decisions? Republicans across this country. So many politicians, especially the Republicans, are outraged by her aggressiveness to just basically take over the White House and become Madam President. I'm not sure this, how that really could happen, but it did. It enraged Republicans. But he obviously didn't have a ton of time left, right? Well, let's go back and talk about Wilson's League of Nations. Does it ever go through? No, not as he planned it. His League of Nations was defeated for good after his stroke. It disappeared. But what really didn't we settle very good today? We talked about it. We didn't really settle it much. We talked about it. Talked about greed and everybody wanting something for themselves.
Oh, the spoils.
Well, which was really what? What were they in France to do? Sign a treaty. We never did really do that. We really never ratified the Treaty of Versailles, which would end World War I. Never really ratified it until later. Actually, it was 1921 before they officially ratified the Treaty of Versailles. Which means we were technically at war with the United States was technically at war with Central Powers until 1921. Even though we weren't fighting anymore, when the war end kind of officially? November 11th, 1918. Even though then we were officially or technically at war with the Central Powers until 1921. And in that year, the United States signed separate treaties with each of the Central Powers that fought. Each one. We signed not an overall treaty, but we signed separate treaties with all the different nations that were involved. Signed a treaty with Great Britain, our ally. Signed a treaty with Germany, our enemy. Signed a treaty with Austria, our enemy. Signed a treaty with France, our ally. We signed separate treaties with every country that fought instead of having an overall, because we didn't want to be at war with any countries in the Central Powers, and we technically were. Weird ending, okay? All right, here's the plan. Tomorrow, bring in your notebooks and we will review Native Americans, especially to talk to Fort Phil Kearny. Make sure we have our stuff together, and we'll talk about what you need to wear on the trip when we're leaving, when we're getting back, how much money you need to bring for the dash in, and that type of thing. Now make sure you are in class tomorrow, because if you miss this class tomorrow, you cannot go. Sully, if you would like to do something differently tomorrow for the guidance office and work on homework, that would be great with me if that's what you'd like. Well, you could, yeah, you're gonna have to. You could work on that too, yeah. Yeah, maybe that's what we'll do with you, is you can just take that time to go down to the guidance office. And anybody that has to do with Fort Phil Kearny is who you can write on.